And we're live on LinkedIn.
Yay! Brilliant. You can see all my deco behind me. Woo! My office.
And behind me too.
I think your office looks way more kind of professional than mine. You can see my calendar from my godson. Yeah, amongst other things, papered to the wall.
No, it's excellent to have you here, and welcome everyone to this LinkedIn live session launching my white paper on harnessing the skills of neurodivergent employees. I'll hand over to Fiona to introduce herself.
Cool. Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Fiona Uagu. I run a team for a global agency, a 60+ team. For a global agency, and I have worked with I've led teams in the UK, in Kenya, in Nigeria, and across sub-Saharan Africa. So when Kate asked me if I would be willing to play host to this particular LinkedIn Live, I absolutely jumped at the opportunity. To give you a bit of information about myself, I recently shortlisted for the Advertising Week Europe Future is Female 2024 cohort, which I'm very proud of. And as I said, I am a people manager. I have run big teams, small teams. I love, that's the bit of my work I love the most, leading people. And I say quite openly, I will happily take the time to get to know every single individual on my team. I give myself minimum 3 months because every team is built on every individual that's part of the team, not the leadership, but the team itself. So it's really important to make sure that everyone on your team, how they work, how everything they do comes together to deliver success for the team. But that's just a little bit about me. I'm going to hand back over to Kate to give herself an opportunity to introduce the white paper, most importantly, as well as, we'll run straight into the questions. Just from a housekeeping perspective, what I will say is we have a chat so we can see any questions you have. Please feel free to plug your questions in as we go along, and the aim will be, as we are moving, we will be pulling questions out and asking them. So with that, Kate, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fiona. And I feel very privileged to have you hosting this Q&A session. You are a stalwart of the advertising and marketing industry. So, thank you so much for participating. But for those of you who've joined, you may know I'm Kate Asiche. I'm founder of Where to Look Communications and proud parent of 2 neurodivergent children. I'm a passionate advocate of neurodivergence as a result of that. And I've spent the last 20 years running internal communications for FTSE 500 and 250 organizations. And my mission now is to train organizations to be culturally aware of neurodivergence and to build neurodivergent friendly cultures, primarily through people managers and training people managers. So that's me in a nutshell. And my white paper is come out of all of that. It's really focused on harnessing the skills of neurodivergent employees, helping people managers, helping organizations to understand how to work with neurodivergent people, how to build a team with neurodivergent people, understanding their requirements, and to be successful in that. And that was the whole driver behind writing the white paper, which I'm launching today.
Oh, excellent. So I'm going to dive straight in with the questions I personally have, because obviously I've read the white paper. As I think in my introduction, I mentioned I have a 60-strong team. And within my team, I have at least three people with diagnosed neurodivergent characteristics. So in any organization, I think what most of us will understand as team leaders is that not only do you have a job to do as a line manager, but obviously, we also have to, you've mentioned in your paper that the line managers have a really sort of key role to play in terms of creating an enhanced experience for people with, neurodivergence characteristics. talk to us about that role that you feel line managers have to play.
Yeah, I mean, I say it time and time again and constantly banging on about the whole idea around people managers shaping the employee experience, because it's like night and day, a manager who understands their team members and a manager who doesn't. And we've all heard the saying that people don't leave organizations, they leave their managers. And that's just because it's everything in terms of your everyday interactions, your everyday experience as an employee is dependent 95%, 100% on your relationship with your line manager, your immediate supervisor. So it's really on them. You know, the onus is on people managers. And I know they've got their own roles to do, they've got their own individual projects to work on. But if you decide to be a people manager, you decide to manage a team, that comes with huge amounts of responsibility. And part of that responsibility is to understand your team members, particularly when they're neurodivergent. To understand how they like to work, you know, how to get the best out of them, what it is they need to be their best and to do their best work, and to take that on board and be flexible, be empathetic, you know, use your EQ, your emotional intelligence to help your organizations to navigate, the organization. That's a role that is quite often underplayed and you know, downplayed, or even overlooked. You know, it's that facilitation, how to help people to navigate an organization, which is usually quite complex.
Mm-hmm. As I'm going through, I will be picking out bits from your white paper. But the next question I have for you is: so you mentioned that someone with neurodivergent characteristics can have, you know, parts of their day feel quite challenging. Yeah, obviously, as a neurotypical, that's not easy for us to understand. So please help us understand the kind of things that might make, you know, like what seems like an ordinary day feel quite challenging.
Yeah, so for neurotypical people, you know, you often hear everyone finds certain aspects of the working day challenging, but for neurodivergent people, it creates a lot of difficulty, distress, stress, anxiety. So, for example, things like the commute, the morning and evening commute, the noise, the smells, the social interaction by force. You're having to stand and perhaps even have a conversation because you're squashed up against someone in a tube or a train or a bus. That discomfort is real. And it's easy to say, well, you know, everyone has to deal with the commute, you know, go and, you know, get on with it. But it's very different for a neurodivergent person, particularly an autistic person, to have to deal with that. It's very overwhelming. And I know from experience that autistic people in particular who have social anxiety, once they're in a setting where they have to interact with people, can find that physically draining, mentally and physically draining. And you have to understand that in order to go through that experience, there needs to be some recovery built into the day. So it's things like the commute, it's things like noise, it's things like touch, it's things like smells that can overwhelm the senses and create discomfort.
Okay, that's really interesting, because obviously, as an employer, these seem like relatively straightforward things, but obviously they do have such a massive impact.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, over time, I've put it, and I would love to have had someone like you help me in the process. But the way I've tackled the challenge from a personal perspective is to suspend all kind of perception or judgment of who I'm dealing with and what they need until I've spent a minimum of 3 months working with them. I've seen, you know, like what makes sense to them versus what doesn't, how I need to engage with them in the process so that I, you know, like I am helping them work at their best. But I'm hoping, you know, watching us now will be people who are in the position I was in quite a few years ago. So, you know, what sort of frameworks, you know, like in terms of, you know, help, you know, giving them foundational understanding, could some, you know, employers or line managers, you know, can they get, you know, where can they find tools, or, you know, like what services exist for them to help them in this process?
Yeah, so it has previously been quite patchy, but there are now consultants like myself who support organizations to get a basic layer of understanding, that foundational knowledge that is needed in order to, number one, be aware of what neurodivergence is, particularly autism and ADHD. I think that they are, without a shadow of a doubt, the most prevalent conditions, although there are more like dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dyslexia, etc. Dyslexia is obviously more well known, but yeah, there are a lot of resources out there. But I would always say that resources are one thing. Working with someone who understands neurodivergence is the best way, because they can give you that nuance that you need in order to be able to make the right decisions. So often what you see available in terms of resources is black and white, or presented as black and white, but there's a lot of murky gray in there. And that's where, yeah, you can provide context as a consultant. So yeah, you can do your research. There are many books out there, many resources, but I think having that layer of someone who is steeped in neurodivergence day in and day out is really key.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to remind everyone, any questions you have, please pop them in the chat. But how important is it for employers to get to know the types of neurodivergence that exists? Because obviously you've mentioned several. I'm familiar with some of them because
Yeah.
I have, godchildren, or, like family, or I've worked with people with some of these. But obviously, this may be new to some employers who or line managers who don't know.
Yeah, exactly. So there are two of the most prevalent are ADHD and autism. ADD is also another quite prevalent identification, but they are now looping that into ADHD and saying that you are more hyperactive, or you are more focused on inattentiveness, rather than giving people a separate diagnosis for ADD, although it is still a separate diagnosis. And yeah, there's a huge amount, and I say in my white paper that neurodivergence is a meaningless term in a lot of ways, and I mean that in a respectful way, in that neurodivergence makes it sound like it's a package, neatly packaged group of conditions that are all, related to one another. And whilst there is some overlap, there are many commonalities between autistic and ADHD people, dyslexic and autistic people, etc. They are very distinct and separate conditions. So that is why I say it's really important to work with someone who understands the individual identifications and how that manifests, how that might present in the workplace, in an organizational setting, how to support those individuals. Because whilst you have the commonalities within each condition, you also have individuals as individuals. You've got your personalities,
Oh
you've got
yeah.
your opinion, you've got your culture, you've got your gender, on and on it goes.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are commonalities. I put this in my white paper. There are commonalities and there are no commonalities.
So that's where someone like you would come in with where to look communication to begin to understand, like what skills are you looking at, what particular characteristics, what are the nuances, and therefore what should you be thinking. Help me understand then, in terms of the nature of what you're seeing, how have things changed in the workplace, now versus, say, for example, 5 years ago? What are you seeing?
Well, obviously, we all know about COVID. We all know about what happened during the lockdowns all over the world, and particularly in the UK, where we're based. We know that changed things overnight. It's transformed, the way that we work, to being much more receptive to hybrid working. So we've got this new term, hybrid, which means that people split their time between working remotely and being in an office location. And what that has created is a better understanding of individuals' requirements in terms of how they work, how they carry out their work. And of course, we know there are people who could never work in that way because they need to be present in the workplace environment, be it an engineer,
Mhm.
fixing equipment, or a doctor, working on a patient. You can't do that remotely.
Yeah,
But
I know.
then, a lot of a vast majority of knowledge workers like you and I working in comms and marketing can work remotely and do just as good work, if not better,
Mhm.
working in a different location other than the workplace. So for me, I've seen organizations have a better understanding of what the workplace is. What do we go to the office to do? Do we go to the office just to say I'm there?
Mhm.
Do we say that, we're focused on presenteeism? That's not desirable. No one wants to just say I'm in the office because I'm in the office. What's your purpose? Do you go to meet with people? Do you go to collaborate? Do you go to build relationships?
Mhm.
Do you go to have meetings? Do you go to have quiet time? Because not everyone has a nice environment to work from remotely.
Mhm.
And it's also worth bearing in mind that some people work from cafeterias or shared working spaces. Not everybody works from home.
Mhm.
So I think what organizations have had to do by force
Mhm.
is to consider everyone's working preferences, and how that can be worked into whatever business it is they're running.
Mhm. So you've raised some interesting things in terms of like the what hybrid working now brings to not just like the people you have on your team, but the core skills that support getting the most out of them. How can how can you help employers help line managers to like start building a framework for acceptance and support? Because obviously when you talk about presenteeism, as we shift towards being back in the workplace, presenteeism re-raises its
Mm.
head. I'm going
It's
to
ugly head.
yeah, of course. So it raises its ugly head. But obviously, we've got a whole sort of like generation of, like the workforce coming through for whom these characteristics are, like a real sort of, feature of their working and, present life. So yeah, how can you, particularly in your company, help line managers build that framework of acceptance and support? Where would you
Yeah.
to them and push back?
I would say that organizations are the main sort of bearers of that responsibility, especially when it
Mhm.
comes to promoting. So you either hire managers or you promote them.
Yeah.
And therefore there has to be some support for my line managers to understand their role and responsibility when it comes to supporting team
Mhm.
members. I
Mhm.
think a lot of people go into management without understanding that element of it. They want to tell people what to do, yeah, or delegate. That's the favorite bit, giving people handing down work. But we all know that's the least of your concerns when you're a people manager. Your primary responsibility is to take care of your team members. You
Mm.
are there to serve your team members as well as them supporting you. You're there to support them. So organizations have to understand that some people managers will need training, will need development, will need, a framework to
Mhm.
help them to be good team managers, to be good people managers. And then people managers in turn need to take the responsibility for understanding what emotional intelligence, or EQ, the
Mhm.
role that plays, being an empathetic leader, being a
Mhm.
servant leader, being as willing to do for your team as they are to do for you.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, helping your team members to navigate the business by understanding what it is they need to do their best work. And that
Mhm.
all comes down to having conversations, like you just said. You take 3 months, 90 days to
Mm.
get to know your team members properly. And I bet at the end of that, there's not very much, you don't know about the way they work and how you can, create a working environment that suits them. So
Mm.
it's a two-way thing. It's a two-way street. You be flexible as a people manager,
Mhm.
and accommodate people's needs and requirements. And
Mhm.
you also, make it clear what your expectations are and then help your team members to support those
Mhm.
goals and
Mhm.
objectives.
Coming from an organizational environment, I mean, I think I consider myself fortunate in that I've, like where I've worked over the last 12 years, our talent management team have been incredibly robust and incredibly supportive in helping line managers to develop. But I think, a lot of what I've implemented from a personal perspective, my 90 days, has come from having poor managers myself and knowing what I would have really appreciated, from the person who managed me. But what let's be honest with ourselves, what we do still see is situations where, like that need for promotion, that need to step up is always a very personal one. It's where this is where I am, this is what I've gotten to, this is what I want. There may be money involved, but no one, I think fundamentally, no one ever gives you this guidebook and says, okay, you've been promoted now. Here's the guidebook you need to now know how you operate
Exactly.
as a line manager. Help, what can Where to Look Communications provide, or how can they help in that regard, number one? And then number two, what would the role of, say, for example, ERGs have? Because, obviously, as I said, the organization I've come from, ERGs have a huge role to play, and they've almost got their own sort of like manifesto for what they're there to do that is actually very, very support driven.
Yeah, it's all about providing a framework at the end of the day, Fiona. It's not, people see it and they think, well, it's an elephant. What do I eat first? Do I go for the foot, the leg, the trunk? There's so much of it, especially when it comes to neurodivergence. It's a massive topic and people consider it to be a medical one as well. And of course, it is a medical topic. There is, it's a condition. There are medical elements to it, particularly ADHD, where medication is provided for employees or for people in general, and therefore employees as well. So that's one consideration. But it's the small things that make the difference, the biggest difference, and it's guiding people managers to be able to understand what those small things are, minor shifts, minor changes that can transform the life of someone who is autistic. In a working environment to be in a pleasant one versus one which they avoid or want to avoid every single day. It's those tiny layers of understanding that make the difference. Do I seat them near the printer? No, because the printer's noisy, it will disturb them. Should they be near the air conditioning? No, because it's noisy. Might not be noisy to you and I, but it's noisy to them. And it creates some sensory overload. Do I change a team meeting location without giving them enough notice? No, you don't, because that can cause a lot of anxiety and worry. So it's those tiny little things, they're none of them that big, that can make a big difference. And, a company like mine can provide that training to be able to help people to know where to start. It's a journey that you need to go on. And yeah, it's really helpful to have someone to support you on that journey. And that's where I come in.
You do mention in the report that, and I'm glad you touched on it because you reminded me I had that as a question, that, like as employers, we make decisions that seem quite simple and, inconsequential to neurotypical, but, they have a significant impact. When you do have neurodivergent characteristics. Help us understand some of those things. You've just mentioned, sitting by the printer, like in the normal run of things, you might think, what difference does it make if you sit beside the printer versus sit beside the window?
Yeah, exactly. And that's all about knowing your employees. So don't get me wrong, not every autistic person will not want to sit next to a printer. Some might actually enjoy it because of the rhythmic sound of the printer. I know that I like sitting next to printers and scanners because that noise is quite soothing to me. But that would be a good example of, if someone didn't like that, then, put them in a quiet area, let them sit in the same seat every day, because familiarity is really important to autistic people. In some instances, change is very hard. Let them sit in the same chair if it makes them feel comfortable. What harm does it do? Yes, we have a hot desking policy for sure. We want people to move around. We all know that we don't like hot desking, but let's pretend that majority of people feel comfortable doing it. For an autistic person, the idea of hot desking could be a nightmare. You know, you sit there one day, the next day you're sitting in an entirely different position next to someone else who you might not know very well. Yes, of course, we know that you've got to collaborate, you've got to build relationships, but that has to be done in a way which is not going to cause distress, which is not
Mhm,
going to cause anxiety.
mhm,
So if you do, for example, have to make a decision, I'm afraid you're going to have to consider your neurodivergent employees in those decision making processes. So you can't just suddenly say, you know, I want to change the location of a meeting or the time
mhm,
of a meeting, just expect people to turn around and be okay with that, because some of your team members may need some, you know, support in
mhm,
order to get their head around the change.
mhm,
Um, and if you consider that from day one, then it
mhm,
shouldn't be too much of a problem. It's only if you think to yourself, well, that's not important to me, I'm going to dismiss that because everyone just has to get on with it. That's
mhm.
where the problems start. I think having that EQ is so important, that emotional intelligence to say this is going to cause someone in my team distress. I need
Mhm.
to rework my decision making process.
So that's something I really like to sort of dip into in a little more detail, because obviously a lot of employers now are moving back to, though we are still maintaining hybrid working processes, we're moving back to more days in the office. And obviously in attendant in that is, you know, they're more than likely slightly smaller office space available. You know, like the culture of, you know, like hot desking and hybrid working means that the expectation is not everybody's going to be back in every single day, but then you have to deal with days where you come in and there's loads of people
Yeah.
versus other days where, you know, you all may come into the office and there's not that many people. um what should employers be thinking about in this process to support both neurodivergent and neurotypical, because obviously the way you would deal with both isn't, you know, even remotely the same.
Yeah, exactly. So it's all about the purpose of attending the office. Like I said earlier, you know, do you
Uh,
have spaces for collaboration? Do you have spaces for quiet work? Do you have spaces for networking and meeting? You know, it's all about the purpose. What's your office setup? What's the
mm,
environment like? What's the working environment like? What's the culture like? Are people friendly? Do they say hello to each other? Do they, you know, have lunch together? You know, what is it like? Is it a friendly atmosphere? Those are all things to consider, because it's, you know, everybody wants to work in a friendly, welcoming environment, and that's most important for neurotypical people. So asking everyone to come in on the same days doesn't work, because of course everyone's going to be there on those days, and then the rest of the time it will be empty.
mm,
So what you could do as a line manager, if you have the flexibility, is to say, well, most people come in on a Wednesday. Why don't you come in on a Tuesday if you prefer that quiet, you know, environment? There's less people there, less noise. But if you do want to, you know, dip in every now and again on a Tuesday when everyone, or on a Wednesday when everyone's in, you can
mm,
come in for an hour or two, for
mhm,
example, in the morning, check in for the team meeting, for example, coming for a purpose, you know, coming for a reason, do what you need to do, make that, you know, achieve that objective of talking to a couple of people, having those serendipitous moments next to the water cooler where you have a conversation about something you watched on the telly or whatever it is. There was a
mm.
lot of criticism that that was missing during lockdown. So
Yeah.
water cooler moments, and then
Mm,
go back home if you so wish, if
mm,
it makes you feel comfortable, because a, you won't have the noisy commute if you're going home at, for example, lunchtime. The trains will be empty.
mm,
But b, you also get an opportunity to be in the office, say hello to people, you know, and keep those relationships burning.
mhm. And right, so you there's something you've raised. I'm just going to go back to a little bit, right? So I think I asked a question earlier about training and support and the role ERDs have to play. I'm going to go back to that again, and the reason I'm going to go back to that is, you know, like post immediately, well, towards the end of COVID, Black Lives Matter happened. We saw a massive growth in
Yeah.
DEI departments and support for. But you
Mm.
know, like fast forward 4 years, and BLM is it's not even a dot in the rear view mirror. It's virtually disappeared. And I recently read a piece in the Guardian where a girl had written that 2024 was the year where DEI went to die quietly.
Oh.
Obviously, ERGs, were like a huge sort of like almost like output from like the Black Lives movement and DEI groups. What would you say to employers now, particularly obviously where DEI departments are being sunsetted, and when they are, obviously it has an impact on ERGs. What would you say to them, particularly in this regard?
Yeah, it's really sad the way that those budgets are being rescinded and so quickly as well, as though they were never important, as though it was a nice to have, like something on the side, which is quite shocking because we all know that the most successful organizations are the ones that have a strong policy around inclusivity.
Yeah.
That whole DEI, that whole equity, that whole inclusivity, diversity is really prevalent in organizations that do well. So it makes sense from, a business perspective, as well as being, morally the correct thing to do. But yeah, ERG, I have a love-hate relationship with ERGs, and I've mentioned it before on LinkedIn Lives, because I've seen them being used in a very performative way. So, we've got a group of, neurodivergent people who we're aware of. Let's get them to create an ERG so that we can showcase it on social media come Autism Awareness Day, for example.
Yeah.
And what you end up with sometimes is a group of people doing a lot of work with no pay, with no recognition, with no extra reward or support for that work. They're doing very important things. They're building relationships, they're doing outreach, they're going out into various social settings to promote the business, and talk about the things that they're doing to help their neurodivergent employees. So if ERGs have a strong mandate, are not just sponsored by leader, as in, oh yeah, I support them, and I know that they're there and they're launching it, it's fantastic, but leaders actually come to meetings, listen to members, assign budget, assign resource to do something with the outcomes of those discussions, then I support them. But if they're just talking shops, then yeah, sometimes they can just be a real waste of time and energy. But if they're developed in a strategic way, they can be quite useful. So yeah, for me, organizations just need to take a step back and say, what is it we're trying to achieve with our DEI strategy? How does neurodivergence fit into that? We know we've got neurodivergent employees, regardless of whether they are, formally announced as neurodivergent, or they've actually been open and transparent about their diagnosis. They are still neurodivergent, and of course there will be people in organizations who don't know they're neurodivergent but suspect they are. We all know that many more adults are currently being diagnosed with ADHD and autism. And one of the first things they say is, when you ask them why did they go to be diagnosed, is that I always knew I was different. And so that knowing that you're different needs to be considered. And, if you think about it, if you're not understanding the kind of people that you have in your organization, how to support them, what it is they need to be their best, then you're not going to be successful. You're going to lose people. You're going to have a lot of disengaged employees, and your projects are going to drag, and not necessarily be what you want them to be. So if you want innovation, you want success, you want speed, productivity, engagement, all those good things, then DEI has to be taken seriously, and budgeted and resourced for well.
Do you know, and I couldn't agree with you more, because even within like my team in the UK, our ERGs have made our organisation way more attractive to employees.
Exactly.
because we have we have clear policies behind them. The purpose behind them is really, really clear. But most importantly, I think the thing I would also like to sort of continue from there is that like I've said it, like my team here, 60 strong, three people with diagnosed neurodivergent characteristics. But like as someone who I feel has improved in seeing and understanding when someone is someone is different and unique. I think I honestly believe that being able to work with individuals to see what makes them unique and
Mm,
therefore harness that as part of
exactly.
the collective has actually been instrumental in helping me build high functioning teams. I won't go
Exactly.
into my team in the UK in too much detail, but I will talk about another team I had when I worked abroad where um, like the perception was that there were some, like difficult personalities within them. They weren't pulling in the right direction. You couldn't talk to some of them, or you couldn't get things out of them. Some of them, they didn't seem to understand, basic sort of things. And you know what? They were losing clients as a consequence. And the absolute joy I felt from and I remember when I looked at them the first time, they looked like a broken group of people. But you
Mm,
know what? The thing I said was, look, I'm here. I don't know anything about your market. I know a little bit about what you're doing. So I'm the one who knows nothing. You guys are going to teach me, and I'm going to be your champion. So that was our starting point. And that team turned into just I won so many awards in
mm.
March with that team. 2 years
Well
running,
done.
like like digital agency of the year. Like within the team there were individuals who won young design. It was phenomenal.
Yeah.
I think it simply came from observing the unique characteristics that each of them had and putting it to work with the right support in the most effective way. So I will always advocate to any line manager, any employer, that is quite possibly the most important. If you've got, like a group of like 100 people who all think like you, who act like you don't make any progress. Yeah, you all do the same. You all turn out the same thing. But
Exactly.
the more sort of different mindset approaches to a problem, ways of engaging with the world, seeing the world, and articulating themselves in that world, manages to manifest such huge amounts of sort of creativity and excellence.
Yeah.
With the right support, and with the right sort of nurturing. So yeah, absolutely.
I
Um,
love that. I love what you just said, and it's really everything. When you talk about that, my heart sings because I wish there were more people who thought in that way. Because when you listen to people, when you observe,
mm,
and you are willing to understand, you start to learn.
mhm.
You
Yeah, that's
start to learn yourself. I mean, my children teach me every day about neurodivergence, and not just the annoying stuff or the challenging stuff. They really teach me life lessons,
it.
and that's simply because they see things in a different way to the way I do.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. That's the absolute beauty of it. I think we have to start from the viewpoint that, yeah, I see the world like this, but you know what? Someone out there sees the world very different, and I can learn
exactly.
from it. So yeah. You in your white paper, you also raise a very important point about the differences that occur with diagnosis,
Mm,
particularly when it comes to gender.
yeah,
Yeah, and you talk about stimming. So first of all, I'm going to ask you to define stimming because you know what I think I understood the behaviour. I didn't know it had a label. So
yeah,
I'll ask you to define that first, and then what can line managers do, without crossing personal lines because obviously, you may see characteristics, you may not understand them, you are making assumptions, but you are dealing with an individual and you have to be respectful,
yeah.
and not sort of pigeonhole them or make life even more difficult than it needs to be.
Exactly, and that's the point, not making life difficult for yourself too,
Mhm.
unnecessarily, because stimming is basically a coping mechanism that autistic people in particular, neurodivergent, some other neurodivergent um, identifications also manifest in this way. So stimming is, it could be a movement or a flicking or a stamping or a tapping, and it's usually repetitive. And the idea is that it's calming, and that it helps autistic people to regulate their sensory needs and to regulate their moods. So, for example, it could be, I've seen finger waving, finger flapping, something like this, which
Mhm.
to a neurotypical person might look odd, but
Mhm.
to an autistic person is actually serving a very important purpose. Often they'll talk to you whilst doing that, and what it's doing is it's helping them to formulate their ideas and their
Mhm.
thoughts and to articulate themselves clearly. If
Mhm.
you as a manager say to you, "Oh, that's why are you flicking your finger in that way? Can you put your finger down? Why are you doing that?"
Mhm.
"Oh, it's just a habit." Number one, you're embarrassing them. You're making them feel awkward. And number two, you're robbing them of
Mhm.
a very, very important mechanism to help them to manage their working life. So
Mhm.
when you look at it from that perspective, as a manager, you have a really important role to play in being aware of why they might be doing that. And
Mhm.
also, secondly, to be understanding enough to just let them do it. I was
Mhm.
also one of those people who thought that any odd movements
Mhm.
would be considered dangerous or threatening or weird and
Mhm.
draw unnecessary attention, especially to my children. But
Mhm.
now I'm much more relaxed because I understand that if I allow them to stim, and some people don't stim in public, a lot of
Mhm.
people only stim at home, where they
Mhm.
feel more comfortable. They've learnt through many years of teaching to hide their stimming.
Mhm.
If you allow someone to stim, there's actually nothing wrong with that. Obviously, there are stimming mechanisms that are much more intrusive and loud, and perhaps a little unnerving for
Mhm.
someone who sees it. Talking to oneself loudly is another mechanism. But as long as it's, shall we say, harmless enough to go under the
Mhm.
radar, I don't think there's anything wrong with allowing that. And if someone does want to talk to themselves, perhaps they can do so quietly in a whisper, or they can, perhaps leave a room and have some quiet time on their own to have that internal conversation to make themselves feel calmer before
Mhm.
returning to a meeting or a
My
workplace setting, desk.
sister has full-scale conversations with herself.
Yes, yeah.
Full-scale conversations that you're like,
Cool.
you talking to me? You talking to somebody else? So,
Yeah, is there anyone else in the room? Yeah, you do see that. You do see that.
yeah, but
It is
you know,
very unnerving. It is very unnerving when it first happens or when you
yeah,
first come to see it.
mhm,
I think a child is more likely to get away with it because
yeah,
often children do speak to themselves because they've not learned that it's socially unacceptable.
mhm.
But once you get tall enough to be considered, an older child, in their teens,
Own world
yes,
changes.
yeah, everything changes, and I'm going through that right now, and it's quite a process. It's painful on some days, yeah, because people can be quite unkind.
Yeah, I think that's, anything that doesn't fit into the neurotypical mold then becomes a little bit like, oh, what's going on here? But,
Yeah.
as I like to, believe, you will encounter people with blue eyes versus green eyes versus brown eyes. It's just how an individual express themselves. It might be a little bit more different from usual, but, observe, politely observe, ask
Yeah,
questions,
exactly.
if you need clarification, so that you better understand, because each of us has had very different kind of like experiences, upbringings, methods of learning, etc., etc. So these are some of the things, at least, that occurred to me, because I do wonder when people encounter me, but they think I'm a bit weird. So
Yeah,
that's what's prompted me to ask the question. No emotional intelligence,
yeah,
nothing. It's just that
I
people
know.
you're weird. So
They
you must
just think they think that you're either mad or you're on your way to going mad. And there's even a saying, isn't there, that talking to yourself is the first sign of madness,
yeah,
which
exactly.
doesn't help.
Yeah. I'm going to remind anyone who's there, because I could talk for England. Yeah. Please, any questions you have. Kate, tell me, what do you see in the differences, in genders in the workplace when it comes to neurodivergent characteristics? Because I think reading through your, white paper, it does feel like there are significant differences, or at least perceived differences.
Yeah, well, it starts in childhood. This is the thing, the difference between the male and female presentation of neurodivergence is a massive cavern, because you get females generally masking from day one, because they're taught to mask, and that's societal pressures that are put on women to behave in a certain way. Boys are much more comfortable playing, being naughty, so-called naughty, being loud,
Yeah.
being themselves, without any kind of restriction. Whereas girls learn very early on, it's quite sad when you think about it, to be quiet, to be silent, to be well behaved, to be compliant.
Yeah.
And therefore, their diagnoses are usually later than boys, simply because they toe the line. And no one would know that they were struggling or anxious. And that really makes me feel quite sad, because boys will say, I don't like the noise. I don't want to be in the classroom. I'm leaving the classroom. Whereas the girl would rather suffer the distress internally, be considered to be a good girl, versus playing out and stomping out of the classroom because they feel uncomfortable.
And is that still quite, is that still as prevalent, in terms of that difference in attitudes towards genders at a
I
young
think so. Yeah, I think it is. I think it's something that society has to change. It's really disconnected, to be honest, from neurodivergence as a subject. It's more to do with societal, expectations around gender. As a boy, as a man, you are allowed to be a lot more loud or difficult, or a bit of a bully, or a bit sort of strange, versus a woman. A woman has to be much more compliant, has to be much more obedient. It sounds horrible when I say it out loud, but really you see it played out every day. If you walk around the streets, you'll see the women doing the caring, doing the looking after, doing the sort of the maintenance and the management, and not getting very much, help or support to do that. And I mean, some might say I'm being black and white about it, and I'm being very generic. So of course there are men who do caring. Of course there are men who are quiet. Of course there are men who will be compliant and obedient. But largely, on the whole, when you look at the general picture of society, you'll see that women are much more, should we say, likely to be quiet, be obedient, toe the line, and therefore not receive a diagnosis because no one knows that they're struggling.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned, actually, it's really interesting statistic in your white paper, that 1 in 7 people are autistic. Though there is some truth in the belief that many autistic people end up working in technological or knowledge roles. Yes,
Yeah.
described our roles as knowledge roles. Tell me what brings them to our roles, because obviously, if we've got if we expect, I can't speak this afternoon, if we expect to see more of them coming into the environment, it would be, it's attendant on us to be more prepared, and therefore, ready. There's a great question that's come through.
We have a question, yes, and I'd love to answer that. Thank you so much, Neil, for joining and for submitting that question, asking, do you think there is a perceived stigma that holds people back from talking about being neurodivergent? Yes, there is. I believe there is. I think it's less than it used to be. I'm starting to see more open conversations between people who are themselves neurodivergent. So there's a lot of transparency within the community, but also there's more of a willingness from neurotypical people to ask questions about neurodivergence and be curious about neurodivergence. And therefore, it encourages people who are autistic or who are, ADHDers or dyspraxic or suffering from dyscalculia. Condition and identification to be transparent about that. But yeah, I think there's still a stigma attached to neurodivergence, particularly, I would say, I mean, it's that whole label, isn't it, about disability we were talking about earlier, disability versus, superpower. Is it a disability?
Yeah, I have quite strong feelings about that. I don't like to refer to it as a disability, as you would have heard me saying. I mentioned neurodivergent characteristics. Why? Because like in the industry that we're in, you will encounter people who think conceptually versus people who think just straightforward creatively versus people who think very tactically or very analytically. They do not speak the same language. And my career has been one of a client service person, which means you've got to be the glue that brings everyone together. You're talking to a creative and they're talking very conceptually and you're like, I don't get it, I'm not creative, I don't get it. You really do get stuck. So I in my head, the need to refer to a lot of what they're going through and therefore take away the stigma comes from saying, actually, it's a unique characteristic about how they encounter the world. So let's be supportive and understanding in that they see the world in this way. It's not the way I see the world, but then I can sit next to my creative and I don't see the world in the same way that he does.
Exactly. It's so true. And it's something like 15% to 20% of the world's population is neurodivergent. So that's just not autism, it's also ADHD and all the other conditions, but it's quite a large percentage. You're talking about a lot of people, 15 to 20%. And of those people, quite a large amount are autistic. The vast majority are autistic. And then when you think about the statistic in the UK, around 70%, 70 to 80% of autistic people are being unemployed.
Wow.
To this day, that really is a sad statistic to relay to to an audience, because what can you do about that? What about the children who are now diagnosed? They don't stay children. People automatically associate neurodivergence with children. Still they do that. Even now we're getting a lot of adults who are being diagnosed as neurodivergent. People still assume you're a child primarily, and then you kind of grow out of it, or it becomes less important. And that's simply not the case. What happens in most instances is that children who are diagnosed with autism, ADHD, etc., learn to cope with it. So when they're adults, they're able to hide it a bit more than they would do when they were children. But that's not the same thing as not having it anymore. It just simply disappear.
And that 15%, obviously, I feel like it refers to just the diagnosed. I think we both understand that there are a lot of undiagnosed as well. Does that 15% include that, or is that looking at significantly higher?
Yeah, I mean, it must be higher than that, because those people are not registered, are they? They're not identified. There's no way of understanding how many people who are perceived themselves to be neurodivergent, or have a suspicion that they're neurodivergent, but have not received a formal diagnosis, myself included. So, I have a strong belief that I have ADHD. My son must have got it from somewhere. But I do present with the typical ADHD behaviors, in terms of, being a bit chaotic, piling too much into my day, always wanting to be on the move, always wanting to be on the go, never wanting to sit down. I'm standing now as we talk. I spend most of my day on my feet, which makes my feet sore and my back hurt, but that's another story. Neil's seen a video of me in Austria dancing on a mountain. dancing all the way up a 1700-meter mountain. So that
Lucky
gives you
you.
some indication. Yeah. But there's a huge amount of people who are just learning to live with their neurodivergence. They know they're different.
Mhm.
You know, they always suspected they're different. Why am I know that I'm not quite the same as everyone else. There must be a lot of people like that. You know, how we can help them is a difficult one. You
Okay.
know, you can only help someone who is declared. But like
Mhm.
you say, it's all about knowing your team members well.
Yeah.
You know, understanding what their strengths are, where
Mhm.
their challenges are, and not being judgmental is so key. You
Yeah.
know, reserve your judgment, you know, suspend your judgment until you know what you're dealing with. Get to know people, you know,
Mhm.
harness your EQ,
Mhm.
develop it, your emotional intelligence, so that you can support people. And, you know, none of this is anyone's fault.
Mhm.
I don't think anyone would choose to be neurodivergent. I've heard some people say they would. They love their neurodivergence, and all power to them. But I
Okay.
know a lot of people who would, if they could, uh,
Mm.
be neurotypical.
Okay. With 5 minutes to go, I have one last question before I understand we need to wrap up. We can never forget that we are part of an organization as employers, as line managers, with fundamental business objectives that we obviously need to be, working towards with our teams. So while, I personally may desire to make 100% commitment towards being supportive, in terms of where I have, like people with neurodivergent characteristics diagnosed. What should we be aware of, when it comes to consistency? How should we manage ourselves when it comes to consistency in terms of how we support? Because we might want to be operating at 100%. I can't even operate 100% for myself. So, I'd be very honest and say, an organization may struggle. What would you suggest? What should we be doing?
Well, number one, I'd say work with a consultant like myself,
Mhm.
to be able to begin on that journey in terms of developing a framework for what you can put in place at a very basic level. But, you know, if you want to do this independently and it's possible, the first thing you need to do is do everything bit by bit. You know,
Okay.
learn about your team members, because you can read about autism. As we said earlier, there are many resources out there. You can read for the next 5 or 6 years every day about autism and still not know about your team member. It's all
Mhm.
about understanding what Sally needs, what John or what Bronte or whoever it is needs to be able to function well, to do a good job, to be engaged, and to feel like they're contributing to the business. The
Mhm.
only way you can do that is by listening to people, by
Mhm.
sitting down and getting a good understanding of what your employees need, whether it be flexible working, compressed hours, coming in slightly later, coming in very early, leaving slightly later. You know, these
Mhm.
are all things that are very achievable. They're
Mhm.
not difficult to do, but you have to have an organization that is culturally ready for that kind of flexibility. And
Mhm.
also policy. I would say HR policies play a massive role. There are many people who toe the line when it comes to policy, and rightly so. If the policy says this, we must follow the policy.
Mhm.
And if policy is culturally advanced, which
Mhm.
it should be, then that will, of course, in turn help the people manager to be so. So, yeah, it's a number of things, and the organization can help the people manager, and the people manager can help the team member. And of course, neurodivergent people also have a responsibility to be open and transparent about what they need. You can't
Mhm.
simply expect people to just know it without saying it.
Mhm. Cool. Well, thank you. This has been
Thank
such
you.
conversation for me. I've learned a lot along the way, and to our audience, I will say I really truly hope this has been really informative for you. The
Yes,
white paper itself will be available. You can download it. Kate will share the link for
I
that.
will. I'll put it on LinkedIn.
Yep. And she'll also share the URL and email address for Where to Look Communications, who, obviously are, like a wonderful sort of resource in terms of helping you set up frameworks within your organisation to manage, like your and get the most out of your people with neurodivergent characteristics. I've got to say it effectively. But Kate, you know what? I'll give the final words to you, but thank you for the honour of leading this topic because with you, because it's been, it's one that's very close to my heart, as I said.
Yes, and I knew that's why you would be an ideal co-host. So thank you so much, Fiona. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you host this Q&A session. And if you don't know anything about Fiona, please do look at her LinkedIn profile. She's an outstanding leader. I can recommend her wholeheartedly as someone that you should get to know and you should follow. As Fiona said, I will post the link to download the white paper in the comments of this live stream. You can play it back if you haven't been able to join in the live session, and also a recording will be made available afterwards. I'll post it in the next few days on LinkedIn. But thank you to those who joined. If you're watching on playback, thank you for listening, and please feel free to contact me on LinkedIn.
Thank you. Okay, thanks very much.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody. Have a lovely evening.
Oh, you've gone.